They said it was a lie. They called it the greatest forgery in the history of Christianity, a painted cloth, a medieval trick, a desperate attempt to manufacture faith where none existed. They ran their tests. They published their results. They held their press conferences and declared, with the confidence of modern science, that the matter was settled. But no one asked me. No one asked the man who carried it through burning cities, who wrapped it in oilskin and hid it beneath floorboards while soldiers searched room by room, who watched it survive fires that turned stone cathedrals to ash while the cloth itself remained untouched. I have spent my life with this thing. I have pressed my forehead against it in the dark and wept and prayed and doubted and believed, sometimes all in the same hour. And I am telling you now, there are two truths about this cloth. Not one. Two. The first truth will make you believe in miracles. The second truth will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith. By the end of this, you will have to choose which truth you can live with. If you've ever stood at the edge of belief and looked down, stay with me. This is the story they don't teach in church. My name is Brother Anselm, and I have been keeping this secret for longer than most men are alive. I came to the cloth when I was 19 years old, a novice monk, barely old enough to shave, assigned to the lower vaults of the cathedral at Leary. They gave me a lantern and a key and told me to guard the reliquary chamber through the night. They did not tell me what was inside. I remember the moment I first opened the case. The cloth was larger than I expected. Nearly 14 feet of linen folded, aged, the color of old bone and smoke. And on its surface, faint as a whisper, the image of a man. Not painted, not drawn, not stamped. Present, like a shadow that had decided to stay. I stood there for a long time. The lantern flickered. The stone walls pressed in around me. And I felt, and I know how this sounds, I felt as though the man in the image was looking back at me. That was the beginning. Over the decades that followed, I watched pilgrims weep before it. I watched scholars argue over it in Latin, their voices echoing off the vault ceiling, growing louder and more certain the less they actually knew. I watched church officials lock it away during times of doubt and parade it publicly during times when faith needed a spectacle. And through all of it, the wars, the fires, the relocations, the accusations, the cloth endured. In 1532, a fire broke out in the chapel where it was stored in Chambry. The silver reliquary melted. Molten metal dripped onto one corner of the cloth, leaving burn marks that you can still see today. The Poor Clare nuns repaired the damage with patches. But the image survived untouched. I was not there for that fire. I was long dead by then. But I had seen enough in my lifetime to understand one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever this cloth is, it does not behave like something made by human hands. And that is where our story truly begins. Let me tell you what the scientists found. Not the ones from 1988. The other ones. The ones whose conclusions were quieter, because quiet conclusions do not sell newspapers. In 1978, A team of 40 scientists spent 5 days examining this cloth. They called themselves STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. They brought spectrometers, infrared cameras, X-ray fluorescence equipment, every instrument available to modern science at that moment in history. They came expecting to find paint. They found none. No brushstrokes. No pigment embedded in the fibers. No capillary flow, the natural bleeding of liquid into linen that occurs whenever paint or dye is applied to cloth. The image on the surface of this linen was not created by any substance applied from the outside. It was as if the fibers themselves had been changed, oxidized, aged, but only on the very outermost surface of each thread. Not beneath, not through, only the surface. The depth of the discoloration, 200 nanometers. That is thinner than a single human hair divided into 500 equal slices. No medieval forger had the tools to work at that scale. No medieval forger had the knowledge that such a scale even existed. And then there is the image itself. When photographers first captured the cloth on film in 1898, a man named Secondo Pia nearly dropped his developing plate when he saw with the negative revealed. The image on the cloth, which appears faint and strange to the naked eye, became, in photographic negative, a perfect three-dimensional portrait. A positive image hiding inside a negative. That is not how paint works. That is not how dye works. That is not how any known artistic technique of the medieval period or any period works. And the wounds. I have stared at those wounds for decades. The lance mark on the right side. The punctures at the wrists, not the palms. The wrists exactly where Roman crucifixion nails were driven to support the weight of a body. Medieval artists, without exception, depicted crucifixion nails through the bombs. Every painting, every sculpture, every illustrated manuscript. Whoever made this image knew something that evil artists did not. And this is the thought that kept me awake through countless nights and that called vault. Whoever made this image was not making art at all. As the Gospel of John records, chapter 20, verse 6, when the disciple entered the tomb, he saw the burial cloths lying there, and the face cloth that had been on his head, not lying with the burial cloths but folded up in a place by itself. A cloth, deliberately left behind, as if it was meant to be found. But the science does not end there. There is something else. Something the 1988 carbon dating report did not mention, because the men who wrote that report had already made up their minds before they ran a single test. Let me explain what I mean. The cloth has a history of damage. Not metaphorical damage. Physical, documented, catastrophic damage. The fire of 1532 in Chambry. The water used to extinguish that fire. The handling by hundreds of hands across hundreds of years, pilgrims, priests, kings, soldiers. Every time the cloth was displayed publicly, it was touched, folded, unfolded, pressed against the faces of the faithful who believed that contact itself was a form of prayer. Each of those contacts left something behind. Bacteria, fungal growth, carbon residue from candle smoke, oils from human skin, repair patches sewn directly into the original weave by the Port Clare nuns after the 1532 fire patch is so carefully integrated that even trained eyes struggle to distinguish them from the original linen. And in 1988, the 3 laboratories that conducted the carbon-14 testing in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson cut their samples from the same corner of the cloth. The same corner where the fire damage was heaviest. The same corner where the repair patches were most concentrated. Chemist Raymond Rogers, a member of the original STURP team, a man who began his investigation as a skeptic, spent years after 1988 analyzing threads from that exact quarter. His findings, published in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochemia, Acta in 2005, confirmed what many had suspected. The threads tested in 1988 contain cotton fibers. The rest of the cloth is linen. Medieval repair work invisible to the eye, detectable only under chemical analysis, have contaminated the very samples used to date the entire cloth. Rogers concluded, based on vanillin content alone, that the main body of the shroud was of minimum 1300 years old. Possibly older. 1300 years. That would place its origin not in medieval France but in 1st century Jerusalem. I remember the first time I read a translation of Rogers' conclusions. I was very old by then, in the way that men who have dedicated their lives to a single mystery grow old inside it. And I sat in the dark with that document and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not triumph. Relief. Because I had always known, in the part of me that exists beneath argument and evidence and theological debate, that this cloth was not made by a forger's hand.
I found it.
And I had always feared that I was simply a man who wanted to believe.
Get out now.
But wait. There is something the historians have never been able to explain. Something that does not fit either side of this argument and that both sides have quietly agreed to ignore. The image on this cloth is three-dimensional. Not in the way a painting creates the illusion of depth. Literally three-dimensional and coded with spatial data that can be fed into a VP8 image analyzer, the same technology NASA uses to map the surface of planets and produce a geometrically accurate three-dimensional model of a human face. No photograph does this. No painting does this. No other object on Earth does this.
It's undeniable.
In 1976, physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed the shroud image into a VP8 analyzer for the first time. What appeared on the screen stopped everyone in the room. A perfect human form, rising out of the cloth like a sculpture. Every proportion correct. Every wound in anatomically precise location.
I have found it.
Jackson later said, and I want you to hear this carefully, that the only way to encode three-dimensional spatial information into a two-dimensional cloth surface is if the image was formed by some kind of radiation emanating outward from a body lying beneath the cloth. Not paint. Not dye. Not the hand of any forger. Radiation. The kind of event that has no historical precedent. The kind of event that, if it occurred, would have lasted less than a fraction of a second and would have left exactly the kind of image we see on this cloth today. Everything I have just told you is true. Every scientist I have named is real. Every study I have cited is documented. Every detail about the fibers, the wounds, the three-dimensional encoding, it is all in the public record, available to anyone willing to look. And yet, there is another truth, one I have wrestled with in equal measure, one that does not disappear simply because I find it inconvenient. Everything I just told you is true, but so is this. The year was 1988, and for the first time in its history, the cloth was subjected to a test that did not care about faith, did not care about miracles, did not care about the tears of pilgrims or the prayers of monks or the testimony of men like me. Carbon-14 dating cares only about physics. Here is how it works. Every living organism, every plant, every animal, every human being absorbs carbon from the atmosphere while it is alive. When it dies, the absorption stops. And from that moment, the carbon-14 within its fibers begins to decay at a rate so precise, so consistent, so mathematically predictable that scientists can measure it and calculate, with remarkable accuracy, exactly when the organism died, when the flax plant that became this linen was harvested. 3 independent laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, Tucson, 3 teams of scientists who did not communicate with each other during the testing process. 3 sets of results, calculated separately, submitted separately, analyzed separately, and all 3 arrived at the same conclusion. The linen of the Shroud of Turin was produced between 1260 and 1390 AD. The Middle Ages. Not 1st century Jerusalem. Not the tomb of a crucified man in Roman-occupied Judea. A medieval workshop somewhere in Europe, most likely France, producing a cloth that someone, for reasons we can only speculate about, decided to present to the world as the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. I have to be honest with you now. When those results were published, when the church issued its statement acknowledging the findings, when the Cardinal of Turin stood before the cameras and said the cloth could not be considered a relic, I did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected grief. The collapse of something I had built my life around. Instead, I felt something colder. I felt the specific discomfort of a man who realizes he may have been protecting a lie. Not deliberately, not cynically, but with the false sincerity of someone who never thought to question the story he had been handed at 19 years old in a cold stone vault with a lantern and a key. And the history, when you examine it honestly, does not help. The cloth appears in documented historical record for the first time in 1353 in the possession of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny, in the town of Liry. Before that date, nothing. No mention in any Byzantine record. No reference in any early Christian writing. No description in any pilgrim account from Jerusalem or Constantinople. For 13 centuries of Christianity, a religion that venerated relics with an intensity we find difficult to imagine today, not a single writer mentioned a burial cloth bearing the image of Christ. Then, in 1353, in medieval France, it simply appeared. And when the local bishop investigated its origins, He concluded, and this is documented in a report to the Pope in Avignon, that the image had been, in his words, cuttingly painted. The artist who painted it. Not a miracle. Not radiation. Not an event beyond human explanation. A painter. Working in medieval France. Creating something he knew would be venerated or sold as the most sacred object in Christendom. I sat with that bishop's report for a long time. And I thought about the 19-year-old boy I had once been. Standing in that vault. Feeling the presence of something looking back at him through ancient linen. And I asked myself the question I had spent a lifetime avoiding. What if I felt what I felt, not because the cloth was miraculous, but because I needed it to be? But the questions did not stop there. Because if the cloth is a forgery and the carbon dating says it is, then the forger was not merely a talented painter. He was a genius. An impossible genius. Think about what this hypothetical medieval artist would have had to know. He would have had to know that Roman crucifixion nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms. Knowledge that was lost for centuries and only rediscovered through modern archaeological excavation. He would have had to understand, with anatomical precision, exactly how a flogged body looks, the direction of the wounds, the angle of the scourge marks, the way blood pools and flows differently depending on the position of the body. He would have had to somehow encode three-dimensional spatial information into a two-dimensional surface using a technique that no one in the 14th century understood, and that we ourselves only discovered accidentally in 1976 when NASA technology revealed it. And he would have had to do all of this, all of it, without leaving a single trace of pigment, without a single brush stroke, without any physical evidence whatsoever that a human hand had touched this image. For 700 years, I have spent my life in the company of forgers, not criminals, scholars, men who study the history of religious fraud, of manufactured relics, of the medieval trade in holy objects that fueled the economy of the church for centuries. They are not naive men. They are not men who believe everything they are told. And every one of them I have ever spoken to about this cloth has said the same thing. If it is a forgery, we do not know how it was done. That is not a small admission. That is the entire problem. There is one document the church did not want you to read.
This is the key.
Not the bishop's report. Not the carbon dating results. Something older. Something that was locked in the Vatican's secret archives for decades and only became accessible to researchers in the late 20th century. It is a series of correspondence between church officials in the 14th century, letters that discuss, in careful and diplomatic language, the problem of the cloth at Leary. Not whether it was authentic, whether it was useful. The language is precise and cold in a way that institutional language always is, when the people writing it know exactly what they are saying and are counting on future readers not to notice. One letter refers to the cloth as it had translated from the Latin as faithfully as a can, a matter requiring careful management rather than resolution.
The truth is here.
Not investigation. Not authentication. Not the pursuit of truth. Management. I read that letter 3 times before I understood what it meant. The church did not know if the cloth was real, and they decided formally, in writing, in a letter that survives 7 centuries in an archive, that knowing was less important than managing. Managing the faith of the people who needed it to be real. Managing the revenue of the pilgrimages it generated. Managing the political relationships between the families who controlled it. I am not telling you the church fabricated the shroud. I am telling you that at the highest levels of the institution I devoted my life to, there were men who looked at the question of its authenticity and decided that the question itself was inconvenient. And in that moment, in the cold silence of that archive, I understood something about faith that no theology lesson had ever taught me. Faith is not always the opposite of doubt. Sometimes faith is the decision to stop asking. So here we are. You have heard everything I know. Everything I have carried for longer than I care to remember, through cold vaults and burning chapels and archive rooms that smelled of dust and secrets, and the particular lowliness of a man who has given his life to a question that refuses to be answered. And now it is your turn. But before I hand this to you, before I ask you to choose, I wanted to do something that neither side of this debate does often enough. I want to tell you exactly what the evidence actually shows. Not what I believe,
as inscribed
not what I need,
is
what the record shows. Because that is the only honest place to stand. What the evidence for authenticity actually shows. The STURP team of 1978 40 scientists. 5 days. Every instrument available found no paint, no pigment, no brush strokes of any kind. The image exists only on the outermost fibers of the cloth, at a depth of 200 nanometers, in a pattern that no known artistic technique can replicate. The VP8 image analysis of 1976 revealed three-dimensional spatial data encoded in the cloth's surface data that produces a geometrically accurate human form when processed through NASA imaging technology.
Yes, that's it.
No other artwork,
It's definitive.
photograph, or textile on Earth does this. Chemist Raymond Rogers, publishing in Thermochemia in 2005, demonstrated that the corner sampled for carbon dating contained cotton fibers inconsistent with the rest of the linen, evidence of medieval repair work that contaminated the 1988 results. The wound patterns on the image wrists, not palms, the angle of the scourge marks, the precise pooling of blood are consistent with 1st century Roman crucifixion practices that medieval artists universally got wrong. These are facts. Documented. Peer-reviewed. Available to anyone willing to sit with them long enough to understand what they mean. What the evidence against authenticity actually shows. 3 independent laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, Tucson, using carbon-14 dating methodology, arrived at the same conclusion independently. The linen dates to between 1260 and 1390 AD. The cloth appears in no historical record before 1353. When it surfaces in medieval France in the possession of a knight with no documented connection to any earlier custodial chain. Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, in his 1389 memorandum to Pope Clement VII, stated explicitly that the image had been painted and that the artist responsible had been identified. Vatican correspondence from the same period discusses the cloth not in terms of its authenticity but in terms of its management, a word that carries, in any language and any century, exactly the weight you think it does. These are also facts, also documented, also available to anyone willing to look. What Scripture actually records, the Gospel of John describes burial cloths found in an empty tomb. It does not describe an image. It does not describe a face. It describes linen, lying where a body had been, and a separate cloth for the face, folded and placed apart. Whether those cloths and this cloth are the same object, Scripture does not say. That silence is not an accident. That silence is the space where faith has always lived.
Oh Lord, your
2,000 years of scholars, theologians, scientists, and skeptics have stood in that silence and reached different conclusions. Some found God in air. Some found fraud. Some found something they could not name and carried it with them quietly for the rest of their lives. I know which category I belong to. Sources: the Shroud of Turin Research Project, 1978, full findings archived by the Holy Shroud Guild. The VP8 image analysis by John Jackson and Eric Jumper, 1976, published Proceedings of the United States Conference of Research on the Shroud of Turin. Raymond N. Rogers, Studies on the Radiocarbon Sample from the Shroud of Turin, Thermochemia Acta, Volume 425, 2005. The Carbon-14 Dating Results, published in Nature, Volume 337, February 1989, Damon et al. The Memorandum of Bishop Pierre Darcas to Pope Clement VII, 1389, Diocese of Troyes Historical Archive. The Gospel of John, Chapter 20, verses 5 through 7, King James Bible. Full references and source links in the description below. I have told you both truths now. I have not hidden one to protect the other. I have not weighted the scales in the direction I find more comfortable. I have stood before you, an old monk who has spent his life in the custody of a mystery, and I have given you everything I have. And I find, at the end of it, that I am still not certain. Not because the evidence is weak, because certainty, I have learned, is not the same as faith. Certainty closes the question. Faith keeps it open and lives inside it anyway. Whatever this cloth is, a miracle wrapped in linen, or a masterpiece of medieval deception, it has done something that neither science nor theology can fully explain. For 7 centuries, it has made people stop. It has made them look. It has made them ask the question that sits beneath all other questions. Is there something more than what we can see and measure and explain? That question, not the cloth, is what I have spent my life protecting. And now I leave it with you. So now you know what I know. Every study, every argument, every document locked in every archive that was never meant to be read by people like you. You have heard the scientists who found no paint and no brush strokes and no explanation that fits within the boundaries of medieval technology. You have heard the laboratories that ran their tests and returned their results and stood by their numbers with the quiet confidence of men who trust physics more than faith. You have heard the bishop who said it was painted, the chemist who said the sample was contaminated, the physicist who said the image contains data that should not exist. And you have heard me, an old monk who has spent more years than he can count in the company of this cloth, tell you that after everything, he still does not know.
This burden
Now it is your turn.
is yours now.
I want you to do something before you
You will
close this
obey.
video. I want you to decide,
There is no other path.
not for me, not for the church, not for science or skepticism or any institution that has already made up its mind and is no longer listening. For yourself. Because that is the only verdict that matters. May you believe the cloth is authentic. The science is contaminated. The history is incomplete. And there are things in this world that do not yield to carbon dating. You believe that what those scientists found in 1978 points towards something that has no natural explanation. If that is where you stand, tell me why in the comments. I want to hear your reasoning.
You must
I
listen
want to
the
understand
ancient
what it
prophecies.
feels like to stand on
Only
that
then
side
will
of
you
the
know
question.
true path.
Team B, you believe the cloth is a forgery. The carbon dating was conducted by 3 independent laboratories and they all agreed. The historical record before 1353 is silent. The bishop identified a painter. The science of faith does not override the science of physics. If that is where you stand, tell me why. Tell me what it would take to change your mind. Tell me if you think the question even matters. And if you are standing somewhere in the middle, if you find yourself unable to choose, unwilling to close the question, living in the silence that Scripture left open, and tell me that too. Because that is where the most honest conversations begin. The story does not end here. Next we go deeper. There is another object, another mystery, another man whose story has been told by everyone except himself. If you believe truth deserves to be heard, you know what to do. Team A or Team B? The shroud has survived fires, wars, and 7 centuries of doubt. But can it survive your verdict? Tell me why you believe what you believe. I read every comment.